right now we'll go towards our next guest speaker, Dr. Haiyun Ma, Associate Professor, Frostburg State University. Title of his speech would be U.S. exists, it is U.S. exit from Afghanistan, a Chinese perspective. Sir, floor belongs to you, sir.
Okay, can you hear me now, Mr. Fasel? Okay, thank you very much. It's really nice to meet our friends again. And also I'm glad to see my Georgetown alumni, Michael here. So I'm glad we really share some interest in Afghanistan. And again, before we talk about Afghanistan, I'm not really too optimistic, like Michael said. If you look at current situation, if you look at US-China competition, if you look at the regional, power game, if you will, since you just mentioned India and Pakistan, all these old, rivals. Now quickly you say Russians, Chinese, Iranians, right? Now, let me basically first clarify what's the Chinese objectives and also advantages in Afghanistan. And of course, from I think last week when Taliban visited Beijing, Tianjin, not really Beijing, a lot of discussions, social media, and people began to speculate. China probably will replace the United States. This is really exaggerating, from United States or from European perspectives, because people worry about probably you have second Soviet Union, replace the United States, not only in Asian Pacific, possibly in Central Asia, Afghanistan. And also some Chinese friends, China's friends like Pakistan, probably to be too optimistic because they say this is really opportunity for China to step in this United States field. And also like General Talik Han just mentioned, since you already have a huge CPEC projects there, if you extend it into Afghanistan, then probably you can really promote regional connectivity. That's basically true. I would say it's kind of ideal blueprint. But remember, keep in mind, when Chinese government, they met with Taliban, their priority or their, most concerned issue they discussed with Taliban actually is about security issue. It's not really about Afghanistan, or it's not really about Afghan security or regional security. They really care about our concern about the so-called East Turkmenistan Islamic Movement, the specific Uyghur militant organization. So that's what here, remember, this is not really, a big cause for all regions of Afghanistan. And also, of course, you can imagine, China does have good relationship, not only with our parties in Afghanistan, Taliban, Kabul government, but also with neighbor countries of Afghanistan, especially with Pakistan and Iran, which is very important if you think of the United States has targeted Iran as enemy, but how can you solve the Afghan issue, through cooperation with your enemy? So China, of course, here we see some kind of advantage, right? And also, of course, China already initiated CPEC, which of course from Chinese and Pakistani perspective is quite successful. We really don't know what's the future outcome, but at least at this time, we see all this huge project. Even if you go to Islamabad, you'll see the beautiful airport, you'll see the highways, right? So you do have some advantages. And also I think China already have this, so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Of course, that's de facto China is a kind of leader. So if China extended CPEC, if China expanded, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, then of course, Afghanistan is the ideal target. So that's the potential. But you really have to look at China's limit, not only as simply what people call like, a superpower, possibly true, but Afghanistan, remember, as I said, they really care about East Turkmenistan Islamic Movement. They really care about security issue. They really care about, a Chinese interest in Afghanistan, not really, about Afghanistan or about Pakistan, about, Central Asia or something. And also, China's Afghanistan issue is often through the US lens. That's a big challenge, actually. If you remember the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi repeatedly criticized United States. You guys really, withdraw from Afghanistan. That's why you really created all this, intensified conflict. Well, I would say definitely true. United States withdrawal from Afghanistan definitely, promoted or created all this chaos. But this chaos can never be solved. If you think about from Soviet era to all the way to today, they do not really have kind of, peace in Afghanistan. So we cannot completely blame United States for creating all this chaos, right? But Chinese policy, as I said, because now you have really US-China competition. So that's always when you see all these issues, no matter in Korea Peninsula or Afghanistan, really through this great power competition lens. That's not really good news. And also, if you look at Chinese policy towards Afghanistan, as I mentioned, they complain about the United States, they criticize the United States, but at the same time, you have to remember, United States only withdraw from Afghanistan militarily. United States does not support financial support, which is a really good news, not only for Kabul regime, not only for Afghanistan, not only for Pakistan, not only for China, but for all countries. Why? If United States support financing Kabul regime, now you can imagine the real disaster will come, at least in terms of refugee, in terms of total civil war. Then you can imagine regional powers will back the ethnic group in Afghanistan, Hazara Shia, Uzbeks, Uzbekistan, even Turkey, Tajikistan, even possibly Kyrgyzstan, not to mention Pakistan, right? So that's why here, remember, I said this is a big, I would say, disadvantage or limit for China to look at Afghanistan through United States lens, through US-China competition lens. This is not very good. And also, when we talk about terrorism in Afghanistan, I think China actually followed the US steps, try to politicize some military, our militant organization, as I mentioned, the so-called ETIM. We really don't know where it is, what's the, how many members they have, where they're located. So that's why, if you think about United States initially cooperated with China, I think in 2003, listed ETIM as kind of terrorist organization. But of course, Pompeo delisted. So what does it mean? Of course, it simply means this is a kind of politicization. But now if China insists that ETIM does exist in Afghanistan, now we have to ask, what's the Chinese consideration in insisting this kind of organization? Does China try to use security issue or a pretext, try to advance into Central Asia to counter US or Indian influence? So here we really have to be careful. The Chinese claim about ETIM is really a threat, or it's more like a political accusation. And also, when talking about Chinese involvement in Afghanistan economically, I really don't see much substantial development there. And of course, General Tariq Khan just mentioned China offered Taliban $3 billion in construction or mining development. But I really don't see that kind of benefit Taliban received or Kabul government received. For the INEC copper mine, I tell you guys, actually, I have a friend there working for the project. It's basically nothing. Because this is the first of all, state-owned company, MCC. Now people say, oh, what's the difference? Of course, there's a huge difference between state company and a private company, especially for Chinese state company like MCC. And actually, I remember 2 or 3 days ago, some people discussed, Chinese economic invasion of Afghanistan to talk about, possible occupation of all this mine. I said, no, MCC basically try to hold the mine. They want to sell their stocks in Hong Kong or other city. They don't really develop. If you want to develop a copper mine, you definitely can go to Tibet in China. So that's why here you really have to understand the cultures and the politics of Chinese state company. So that's why you can imagine from 2007 or 8 to today, more than 1 decade. I think maybe Kabul regime basically gets some fee, but not really substantially huge. So that's why in future, if you have such similar project, you really cannot expect more. Even if you think about some Chinese company develop the so-called Daya oil fields equally, I would say, failed, not really successful, right? Because this is the state company, this is a planned economy. You do not really have very vibrant private sectors involved in Afghanistan. If you think about Turkey, you really have huge, influence there, because you not only have ethnic Uzbeks there, but also you can initiate real projects there. Pakistan, of course, in southern part of Afghanistan, right? Iran, basically in Hazara, community or region. Tajiks, basically in especially Tahrir and all these provinces. So that's why you can see the limit of Chinese economic influence. And even when people talk about Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they say, hey, NATO withdraw, United States withdraw, Shanghai Cooperation Organization possibly will help solve the Afghan issue. My opinion is, of course, not. Why? Shanghai Cooperation Organization, first of all, it's basically the same, like, security oriented. They put security, on the top. Second, if you look at the Russian Tajik defense treaties, if you look at Russian Uzbek defense treaty, even Russian Kyrgyz defense treaty, there is no Chinese, right? So basically, this is more about, Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also China-Russian competition is really complicated. I don't really think SCO will replace NATO or the US to stabilize Afghanistan of the region. So that's the whole, I would say, limit. But also something we really have to consider is, if we want to develop Afghanistan, if we try to help stabilize Afghanistan, I do think there are some ways, some roles China can play. First of all, I would think China probably need to re-prioritize its agenda in Afghanistan, because to eliminate any terrorist organization, even including Al-Qaeda, and that's the reason why United States stopped, insisting Taliban, you guys should not have any tie, because United States, I think, perfectly understand you cannot eliminate a organization. China should consider you really cannot eliminate any, ETIM or TRP or other Turkic or weak military organization. Simply put, you cannot pursue a zero terrorism mentality. You should put economic development and cooperation on your agenda. But China is really worried about security issues, terrorism. So that's the reason Chinese investment in Afghanistan is really much limited. And also, as I said, if you look at Afghan borderland, if you look at Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as I said, very much focus on security issue, which does not really help build Afghan economy. Because if every country can say about security, how can you really substantially invest, substantially develop, right? And also, I think remember China really accused United States of withdrawal from Afghanistan. But as I said, usually should remember, United States not abandoned Afghanistan. And if you watch the news, I think several days ago, when Pakistan National Security Advisor, Mr. Yusuf Moeed, visited Washington, D.C. And one of the articles I think published in Pakistan newspaper is, Moeed basically urged the United States not to abandon Pakistan. Now, I would say China should appreciate United States' continuous support for Kabul regime. If United States stop supporting or abandon Afghanistan, that's the real disaster. So that's why I think China really should fully, comprehensively cooperate with the United States. You cannot simply say Afghanistan is another battlefield for great power competition. No country can benefit, especially China, because China not only as kind of enemy of Turkic militant groups, but also remember, for the long run, China is kind of atheist state. I think all Mujahideen groups can easily shift to China. And also because of Xinjiang issue, as you already know, but I don't want to talk too much here. Also, China actually had some problem in history with Central Asian Muslim, Turkic Muslim, especially in Afghanistan. If you remember around 1750s, when China conquered Xinjiang, Chinese government actually executed two very influential Sufi leaders who fled to Badakshan. Badakshan rulers executed them. Then Ahmad Shah actually conducted an expedition campaign against the Badakshan rulers, executed him, and also even waged a kind of jihadism against China. from mid-18th century. Then that jihadism lasted all the way to early 19th century, from Badakshan to northern Afghanistan, finally to Kokand, Central Asia. So that's why if you remember around 1820, you really have kind of Kokand invasion of China or Xinjiang, simply for the purpose of revenging Chinese execution of Sufi masters around 1750s. And also, when we talk about Chinese possible contribution to Afghanistan, I would think China really should substantialize bilateral cooperation, not simply say, hey, we have some big project, we want to invest in Afghanistan. No, that does not really help local population. Every country of Afghanistan's neighbor should substantially help the borderland region. That's the reason if you look at recently some statistics about border crossing revenue, Taliban occupied some, took over some, then of course people began to look at how much money they may get, right? It also indicates how much influence, economic influence, Afghanistan's neighbor country can have, like Pakistan, Iran. Of course, if you look at all the statistics, right? If you look at the Kala Islam, if you look at Pakistan, Afghanistan borderland, you really have a huge revenue there generated. But Chinese Afghan borderland, I think almost zero there. Wakhan corridor, simply because, not because it's a geographic problem, but actually it's more like a political security consideration. So that's why I think China should substantialize local cooperation, especially with Badakshan. By the way, from Badakshan to Tahrir, you really have a lot of mineral resources China can develop. And when I say China can develop, I'm not really talking about Chinese state company. I'm really talking about Chinese private sector. So that's the one. And also, when you talk about all this, bilateral corporations, you also need to connect with regional connectivity. For example, if you develop Badakshan, Tahrir, all the way to West Afghanistan, definitely you need what? Uzbeks, Tajiks, from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, you need to transport machinery. You need to get all this, necessary facility, because you cannot really, transport it from Badakshan. That's the really dangerous, parent. And also, finally, I would think China should encourage private sector. The reason why I in a copper mine field is not simply because of security challenge, not because of all this domestic issue, but actually, as I said, because Chinese state company culture and politics. If you really have private sector involved in Afghanistan, just like the Pakistanis in South Afghanistan, Turkish in West Afghanistan, Iranians in Hazara region, now I think China can really, help Afghanistan develop some economy in, especially Badakshan, Tahrir, or this region. So in future, every country should compete for how much contribution you made. Not really, to see how much political or military, influence you have on Afghanistan. And finally, I want to briefly talk about if China, as a rising empire, if you will, try to avoid the trap of so-called graveyard of empire Afghanistan, you cannot always follow, Soviet, United States to talk about military security. You really should talk about economy, because economy is the only way. If you go to Tahrir, Badakshan, you will see how many young people they're waiting for the jobs. If you cannot provide jobs, of course, you can imagine where they can go into, where they can go into join, right? And also, I think if you look at other countries, United States still is good news to support Kabul regime. Now, I think annual support is like 3 to 4 billion, right? But China cannot do that, because you cannot support either Taliban or Kabul by providing like 3 or 4 billion a year. The only thing you can do is to help local population to develop economy, to hire them as a worker, So that's why practically I would think China cannot really, dominate or replace the United States in Afghanistan. And the last point, I would think for China, if they want to increase influence or help Afghanistan, they really should think about how to build, especially Badakshan, not from a military perspective, because it's really dangerous for China. Why? you have a Russian military base in Kyrgyzstan, basically watching on Chinese. Then, of course, you can imagine United States will go back again to, see China through this great power competition, perspective, right? So that's about Badakshan. It's about 76 kilometers, not really big deal for Chinese company. And also, I think there's a huge potential to develop some basic mines, and if you stabilize one province, China can stabilize in the northeast, Pakistan can stabilize the southwest or southeast, then Iran can stabilize western part, then Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkey can stabilize, some northern provinces. Now I think you really have kind of healthy competition to say, hey, our model, our economy, our company can really bring benefit to local people, local population, not really to support Kabul or Taliban. So that's basically some of my thoughts. Definitely, I hope you can have some questions we can discuss.
Thank you very much, sir. And I do have a question for you. In recent past, we have been faced with a problem that India, it has been using Pakistan's western border to penetrate within Pakistan or to use the elements, the rogue elements within Pakistan of TTP and some of the BLAs and all of these militant organizations. They have been used against CPAC, the very cooperation which brings Pakistan and China further closer. And then what we see, as you have mentioned very well, that ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, though it does not exist on ground, I mean, majority of the ETIM people who talk about it hail somewhere in Europe, and they are runaway people. Do you not think that owing to the fact that India and China had a very fragile situation erupting last year when at Galwan, India and China, they came face to face. Do you not think that in coming times with civil war in Afghanistan, India would try to facilitate itself from the civil war and try to, point some kind of terrorism on CPAC, as well as try to strengthen ETIM through Wakhan corridor, which exists right in the middle of, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China. So do you not think that this might happen? And if it does happen, can we see the escalation into the conflict between China and India at Eastern Ladakh?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Faisal. Yeah, this is really a huge topic. Both Chinese, Indians, Pakistanis, Americans really talk about, in Pakistan, of course, we see several terrorist attacks. And of course, Pakistani Chinese basically customarily, if you will, pointed to Indian. That's understandable, just like China accused ETIM in Afghanistan, right? And also, if you read some news in China nowadays, China really see India in Afghanistan as kind of very hostile existence. If you remember, I think like last year, several months ago, it reported the Chinese like a spy network was basically detected under the help of the Indian intelligence or something. So Chinese basically say, well, if you look at Indians' opposition to CPAC, especially through Pakistan, Kashmir, it's part of a larger Indian-US blockade against China, from Asian Pacific to Indo-Pacific strategy to Kashmir, then of course to Afghanistan. You will see, from the maritime region all the way to Eurasian continent. So if that's the case, especially if in Pakistan, I think last week a Chinese worker was attacked in Karachi, and of course, if you have more information, evidence point to India, then China will be, I think, more and more believe that India actually try to get very close with the United States, try to curb the rise of China. So That's not really good news for India, because in Afghanistan, India, I would say as a, well, I don't know, I don't understand what's the US strategy or logic here, try to bring India into Afghanistan. Because my view is, if you try to simplify the issue in Afghanistan, you should only invite regional country, neighboring country, which are very specific countries you have a physical borderline. Because if you bring India or other countries like Saudi Arabia into Afghanistan, then probably in future you have geopolitical competition, you have a religious competition. That's actually complicated issue. So that's when you look at Blinken visit India when they talk about Afghanistan. Well, I'm thinking, well, the best news for America is if India promised to contribute some money, that's enough. But Chinese media began to report India probably will send troops through Iran to Afghanistan. Then you can imagine what's the Chinese response. China would not think, at least from my understanding of Chinese foreign policy, Chinese policy towards Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia. China would not tolerate any Indian military presence in Afghanistan, especially against Pakistan and the Chinese interests there. So that's what I think for India. Peace is really benefiting India. If you look at Indian market, I visited Afghanistan several times. I met some Indian merchants. They are purchasing gold in Afghanistan. They say, oh, in India, we have a huge demand. I said, wow, that's really cool. In Afghanistan, you produce gold. India, you have a huge market. But if you have war, now you can imagine that's a disaster, not only for Afghanistan, but especially for India, since you do not really have direct borderland connecting there. And also China will definitely step in Afghanistan. Nowadays, I think Chinese policy is really very much, I would say, very much limited. They do talk about Afghanistan, but they never talk about military intervention. But Indians' involvement will probably trigger the Chinese to do that. And so that's what I'm really worried about in future if India decide to do that.
Thank you very much, sir.